Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the President of the American Council on Germany. The coronavirus outbreak has demonstrated ways in which digitalization has helped communities by allowing many people to work from home and by enabling students to continue their education via remote learning. We've also seen how technology can assist with healthcare, both in terms of access and also, and also for those with little, However, the current crisis has also exacerbated the gulf between those with access to technology and those with little or no access. The digital divide has a profound impact on equity in communities, and the increased use of technology also raises concerns about cybersecurity and data privacy. Today, in our series called Transatlantic Perspectives, the local impact of COVID-19, we are pleased to have three guests to discuss how the pandemic has impacted digitalization in communities in the United States and in Germany. Last year, all three of our participants took part in our immersive exchange initiative called Transatlantic Cities of Tomorrow, Digitalization and the Future of Work. This program brings together practitioners and experts from both sides of the Atlantic to drill down on the challenges facing communities as they try to digitize. Sunanna Chand is Vice President of Systems Reinvention at Teach for America. She previously worked at Remake Learning in Pittsburgh. Sunanna, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me, Steve. It's good to be here.
And Bruce Clark is the Executive Director of Digital Charlotte, a non-profit empowering organizations to deliver digital inclusion resources to their communities. Thank you for dialing in.
Thanks for having me.
And also with us is Devin Dienes. He is a project manager at Digital Darmstadt, a specially founded corporation to coordinate and support smart city projects for the city of Darmstadt. Dennis is also responsible for the areas of IT infrastructure, digitalization in environment and conservation, IT security, as well as municipal data management. Herzlich willkommen.
Vielen Dank. Thanks for having me, and I'm a fan of the show.
Excellent. Well, I am super excited about our conversation today because I think that there are a lot of issues that we will be able to cover, and I think this will be fascinating for our viewers. I'd like to start, though, by setting the stage a little bit and asking each of you to tell us briefly about your organizations and how the pandemic has both impacted them as well as the cities that you live in and the communities around you as it relates to digitalization. Sunanna, I want to start with you. I know that Teach for America has programs in cities across the United States, and school systems almost everywhere were shut down as they transitioned from in-person classes in mid-March and into April and tried to shift to remote learning. How has this transition impacted Teach for America's engagement, and how has the organization adapted to this change?
You know, it's been crazy for everyone. I'm just going to send a lot of love to all the educators, both in the United States and around the world, who many of whom have really stepped up to the plate. Such just incredible and with so much ingenuity. And so that includes Teach for America teachers as well. So Teach for America is an organization here in the United States that is locally in 52 regions across the United States. And we have about 60,000 alumni across the country who've done 2 years of service or more as a teacher, and many of whom go on to be administrators, to be education policymakers, just continue to stay in the education field. And so this has dramatically impacted how we do our work. Usually in the summertime, there's something called Institute, where teachers are trained to go into their teaching fellowship, and that has become all virtual. We have no idea if teachers are going to be able to go back to school. 50 million children in the US are now out of school and not actually in the classroom. And it's still very much up in the air and very much state by state, community by community as to kind of how young people are going to be going back. And so there's going to be a lot more about that later on as we talk through digitization and the impact that that has. And what's going on with COVID right now. I think also, it has impacted Teach for America, of course. It's also just impacted the field of education generally, thinking about the 21st century, thinking about, you know, how just blatantly unprepared and unequipped our education system was to really handle the situation, and really just to be a good education system before COVID, right? Like, it just laid bare a lot of the deep inequities and a lot of the deep antiquities of the education system as it stands right now in the United States. And so again, we'll get more into that later, but it has definitely laid bare a lot of these things. And now the education field is reckoning with, okay, how do we go back? Do we go back to normal? I would argue that that is wholly irresponsible. We really have to rethink this entire system if we are to come back responsibly in the fall.
Thank you. Bruce, I'd like to now turn to you. We'd obviously like to hear a little bit about the work of Digital Charlotte in the context of the current crisis. Like in many other parts of the United States, bridging the digital divide in Charlotte was challenging before the pandemic, and it's probably even more challenging now. What has the current outbreak revealed, and might it actually serve as a catalyst to finally address the digital divide with even greater resources?
Yeah, so Digital Charlotte's an initiative of the Night School of Communication at Queen's University of Charlotte. So we're housed in this context of a higher education setting, but charged with being out in the community, bringing together our university community, our regional community, and practitioners of digital and media literacy. And we look at our work across three areas: awareness, education, and action. Just briefly, awareness, you know, making people aware of the issue if they're not already. Education is really providing that deep level of understanding, looking at the intersectionality of the digital divide and issues that communities care about, and then driving towards some action. Right now that you've been given this information or have this information, you know, what are you going to do about it is really the question that we ask people. And so I think, you know, the first thing that really happened was a bright light shined on the digital divide, mostly due to things that Sunanna mentioned with education. And, you know, when you're sending 156,000 students home the next day, and we know that half of those students in CMS are likely going, Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, are going home to a school that doesn't have internet access, or going to a home that doesn't have internet access or may not have a working computer. And then we're asking them to do remote learning with teachers that may or may not have been trained on how to do that with any degree of expertise. You know, we're really setting our communities up for additional barriers, right? I think the other piece is that those communities that are traditionally marginalized, this is not new. The pandemic hasn't really done anything but shine a light on it for people that might be more privileged to have access, who are now realizing that other people don't have access. So you know, I think the communities that we serve are impacted definitely by COVID, but in the context of digitalization, these impacts have been long before the pandemic. So my hope is, I'm just kind of circling back here, my hope is that this attention that digitalization and the digital divide, sorry, I'm trying to say all those together, the attention that has been brought on will lead to, you know, policy change at the federal level here in the US and at the state level, additional funding, both on infrastructure, but also on programs, which is really important. And then change in the local community and in the business environment to understand, if you want to deliver products, if you want to communicate, if you want to take part in a modern society, economy, and democracy and thrive as a country here, everyone in our communities need to be able to not only access the internet, they need to have the device to be able to do it, but they also need the digital literacy skills to bring those three things together and really take part in that modern society.
Before we cross the Atlantic to Devin, I'd like to ask you a follow-up question, Bruce, and bring you in, Sunanna, as well, because you know, you've both talked about the increased awareness at the moment of this digital divide, the fact that, you know, people who had access to the hardware of a computer and good internet access took it for granted in a way and didn't realize just how many people did not have that kind of access. So yes, there's greater awareness, but there's also a sort of single-minded focus on the pandemic and on the economy. and how we address both the public health, but also the economic implications of the current crisis, do you worry that despite the greater awareness about the digital divide, it might still get lost in the shuffle?
Yes. I mean, I think in the short term, yes, but as we continue to look at pathways to the, what does the new economy look like in a social distancing world? How do we reach more consumers? I mean, we're seeing obviously an increase in online spending through the pandemic, but we're still leaving communities out who have spending power. We're still dealing with reform issues that have been going on for 400 plus years in the U.S., especially with racial tensions. And so, I mean, I think that the piece I always think about is like keeping our foot on the gas. I think there's some questions that we'll have a chance to talk more about this, but even with that increased awareness, it's going to require a constant effort to cut through the clutter, not that it's clutter, but cut through the noise of all the information that policymakers and decision makers are receiving right now, to continue to highlight this as a foundational intersectional issue with every other thing: healthcare, the economy, school, the infrastructure, and the ability for communities to have the skill, the access is foundational to all those things. And so continuing to make that point, I think, is critical.
Sunanna, I see you nodding your head. Do you have anything to add?
Whew, I have so much to add. I want to get to Devin. I mean, Devin, it's so good to see you, my friend. Oh my goodness. The question is not just, is there a digital divide? The question is, who is on the other side of that digital divide? And the answer to that question is inextricably linked to systemic racism in this country. I mean, we cannot talk about the digital divide without talking about racism. And, 82%, according to Pew Research last year, 82% of white families had access to a desktop or laptop at home, compared to 58% of Black households and 57% of Latinx households. That is a gap, right? The same is true for broadband internet access, right? 79% of white households, adults, had access to broadband internet, compared to 66% of Black households and 61% of Latinx households. This is not just about homework. This is about an entire economy of people who, most of our essential workers in this country are people of color. A lot of the folks that have to go to work are people of color. And a lot of those jobs that are also being automated right now are done by people of color in this country, again, because of systemic racism and the way that we've set up our foundational systems of our economy. And so if households that are Black, Brown, Indigenous in this country do not have access to the internet to do, not just to do their homework, but to work remotely, right? Like so many other privileged and affluent people in the society have access to, that is gonna happen. We already know that inequities in our society have a dramatic impact on our economy. And it's only going to exacerbate if we don't right now take this moment to connect everything. And I'll talk a little bit later about, like, all of a sudden we have all of these things, like we never had the political and social will before, even though we knew that there were these problems that existed. So there's more to say on that. But for right now, I'll just say that, like, these two things are inextricably linked, and we cannot ignore that fact as we talk about this topic.
Thank you very much. And yes, we will cross the Atlantic now and go to Devin. Devin, obviously the situation in Germany is very different from the situation in the US, but there are some parallels, and that's why we're having this conversation. A few years ago, Darmstadt decided to position itself as a leader in digitalization, and it formed something called Digitalstadt Darmstadt, or Digital City Darmstadt. This initiative strives to make everyday life easier for people in the city through the introduction of new technologies as well as digital solutions that are valuable for citizens, businesses, and the community at large. Can you tell us a little bit about this initiative, Digital Darmstadt, and whether this initiative and its network of stakeholders who are all focused on digitalization has helped Darmstadt be better prepared for dealing with the pandemic?
Okay. Well, in 2017, the Bitkom, which is a large group of German companies in information technology had a competition for digital city in Germany, and Darmstadt made it to the last round and won in the end. And so the state of Hesse and the city and they decided to fund several projects, about 20 at that time, in lots of areas like environment, checking air for pollution, traffic, getting the traffic to flow better through the city, improving the IT infrastructure, doing something about parking, all those things. For this crisis now, it's a good question. How did it help us to be prepared? I think in the area of education, but we will come to that later, I think. It was really a help. Other things, well, with the network, like you said, we had many contacts, so we could act faster. And a little bit of background, the impact of COVID-19 here in Darmstadt was not as hard as in other areas of the country. With 160,000 people in Darmstadt, we had altogether 227 cases until now, 3 of them in the last week, and altogether 18 deaths. That's sad, but also quite low compared to areas in North Rhine-Westphalia and Bavaria. And yeah, well, to keep those numbers low, we had to act, and the measures that were taken, and we had to explain them to every citizen. Yeah? And I don't know if you know the concept of simple language, formulating very short sentences with easy words so everyone can understand them, especially with the German language. Simple language is often an improvement. And so for all those COVID-19 measures like social distancing, mask wearing, all that, we put that out together with the university here in Darmstadt in easy language, not only in simple language, not only in German, but also in 6 other languages, mostly spoken by migrants, asylum seekers, so they wouldn't be left out. And we also produced a video which also via social media spread wide and was taken up from other cities, completely without speech and text, only showing how to behave responsibly. Yeah, and also we quickly got up a so-called digital shop window where all the shops which had to close, some of them, others, yeah, we put all the opening times there, menus from restaurants, how can you order something online, how can you help us with buying gift certificates, all that. And we also got the local e-bike delivery system working with those stores to help them in the time of crisis. And well, maybe a not so good development of COVID-19, but which was typical for digitalization projects here. We had the so-called connected signals, where the status of a traffic light is streamed to your smartphone, which helps you improve what speed do I take here. Will the traffic light turn red? I can slow down here already, all that. It's, it was made by a startup, and they went bankrupt during the high times of the crisis, end of April, sadly.
That's too bad, but hopefully as people start to come back, you know, there will be more opportunities for that kind of innovation as well. Devin, I'd like to pose a question to you that comes from one of our viewers. It's a little different. But Matthew Fieldman, who both you and Sunanna know, would like to know about the Solidaritätszuschlag, or the solidarity tax, which was implemented as part of the German unification process to try to help the states in Eastern Germany as they sort of built up their infrastructure and started to come back during the unification process. And German taxpayers are still paying a solidarity tax even 30 years after German unification. And Matthew asks whether you can talk a little bit about how this tax was implemented to help rebuild East Germany, and whether that might serve as a model here in the US as we try to grapple with some of these new challenges, particularly, I think, as they relate to the infrastructure issues that you're talking about.
Hi, Matthew. Nice that you're here. Thank you for joining. When I saw your question pop up, I thought, how can I dodge that bullet? Unfortunately, I don't know much about, well, taxes and how they're used here. Maybe one misunderstanding, this tax is not only paid by West Germans, but it's paid from, well, your wage from every German citizen. Yeah. It's a part of your income tax. It's only a few percent. It's really low compared to the normal income tax. So you see it on your wage slip, but you don't feel it in your pocket. Over the, well, now 30 years, there must have been billions of that money coming in, but I don't know if it's only for rebuilding East Germany projects anymore. And also over the last years, voices have grown louder to please help West German communities, which are often worse off, especially in North Rhine-Westphalia, Ruhr cities, which have lost all their industry and mining, to help them, and not very well-off cities in East Germany like Dresden or Leipzig. Other cities in West Germany now need it more too. So there has been constant discussion about that tax for 30 years, but I don't think an end is really in sight now with COVID-19.
I guess maybe another way of sort of looking at this question is, do you think that there might be new government initiatives like the Solidaritätszuschlag that would be designed specifically to support digitalization and the digital infrastructure in Germany? I
don't see it coming specifically for digitalization. To well, soften the blow of the pandemic, there has been talk about or not income, but what you already have tax. For
value tax, or
no, a tax for the rich. Well, your possessions are taxed, not what you earn each month. Sometimes also as a one-time tax, but I don't see a majority in the Bundestag for that right now. Talks about that will come up next year, probably, when we see how big the financial impact really was.
We're talking about this in North Carolina. One of our city council members is trying to champion what he's sort of calling a New Deal approach to getting people back to work in laying the infrastructure for the networks of the future. I mean, we know a lot of that's already happening. You can see the trucks pulling cables everywhere in the city and in rural parts of the state, or setting up the antennas to expand networks, but there's still a lot of work to do. And so there's some efforts underway to take that sort of approach in government-funded infrastructure building that would likely be tied to some tax, obviously, to both put people back to work, to expand the networks, but also then to add the other components required to get people online, like the training and like access to the technology.
Thanks. I'd like to maybe pivot back to education and come back to you, Sunanna. You raised earlier the issues around inclusion and inequity, particularly in education. And I guess, given the fact that Teach for America is involved in so many different communities across the US, can you share with us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of how different communities are trying to address this, and whether you think there are any sort of positive cases that we can learn from as everybody tries to grapple with the same problem through the lens of not just the transition from in-classroom schooling to online schooling, but specifically dealing with the issues around inequality and the lack of access given the digital divide.
Yeah, sure, happy to speak on that. I think, first of all, it's important to think about connectivity just not as, whether there is desktop computer or internet access within a home. Because if there are 4 children in a home, you need 4 computers, right? And so a lot of the programs that have been stood up are 1 computer to 1 household, and that's too limited of a way to think about what the connectivity issues are. And I think also I already talked about some of the really big racial disparities when it comes to the digital divide. We also have to, and I think Bruce can probably talk a little bit more to this too, talk about rural places in the United States that have always struggled with access to broadband internet, but even access to cell phone data. I used to work in Pittsburgh, and in West Virginia, connectivity was a huge issue for all kinds of reasons. And there's a lot of different ways in which that's happening. So I used to live in Pittsburgh. I now live in Oakland, California. Here in Oakland, the mayor put out this big thing that was like, we need, internet access and laptops for every single student. And Jack Dorsey of Twitter was like, okay, I'll give you $10 million. And all of a sudden they had $15 million, to go one-to-one for the entire district. That is not the way that it works everywhere. In LA, though, it was similar, where every single, student went one-to-one. And so people celebrate those as really big victories, right? And then in LA, even after every student had one-to-one connectivity, only 40% of young people were logging in. And that is happening over and over and over again, community by community. So then you ask the question, okay, let's say you close the digital divide and young people still aren't showing up. And there's a larger issue with the education system that is undergirding the reason why young people still, even though they have access, they do not have equity and they do not have inclusion. Those are not the same thing. And I think we have to be really clear about that. And then yet in other places, schools are literally just saying, show up in the school parking lot. That's where you can get Wi-Fi. And that's where we are, right? And so young people are literally in cars doing homework for hours. We know that that is not okay. And so, some of these, and some communities are saying we'll put them on buses and park the buses in communities. These are not long-term sustainable solutions. I'd be really curious to hear what Bruce's, has to say about what are the sustainable community-wide solutions that folks are coming up with that are really dealing with this. I'm going to talk a little bit too about so I talked a little bit about how all of a sudden there are all these millions of dollars that are going into. I heard Dr. Bettina Love out of University of Georgia say the other day, particularly as it relates to, again, Black, Brown, and Indigenous students, oh, so all of a sudden there are computers for everyone? All of a sudden people are giving out internet access for free? All of a sudden, parents are crucial to a student's, education? All of these things are things that communities of color, low-income communities have been fighting for so long to get access to these things. And all of a sudden overnight, overnight standardized tests are just gone, which have given so much stress and anxiety to teachers, to students, have put so much stress on the system. And for so long, folks said they couldn't go anywhere. And all of a sudden they're just gone. And so a question that we're asking, I go back to what Bruce said, it is our responsibility on so many fronts to step on the gas and be y'all, you said this wasn't possible. And you just showed us in 2 weeks that it's possible to have every single student have internet access, have every single student have a laptop at home. And so why can't that be possible past COVID as a baseline, right? And so I think that that's like really, really important. I was just listening to a New America Foundation webinar that happened yesterday, that there was a San Jose school district tech director, and he said he was helping rural regions get balloons in the air to try and get access to more rural mountainous regions in the United States. He said, quote, "This is all possible and it can be done. It takes a few people to put their heads together and figure it out and the money to provide it." It's like, it's all possible. We need to just do it and remember this moment and say, we actually can do it.
So Sunanna, let me push you on that a little bit. I mean, you talked earlier at the outset about, the question of, will we snap back to what was normal, or will we create a new normal? And so, do you see this as an inflection point where, education communities might look radically different in June of 2021 than they did in June of 2019?
I hope so, Steve. That's what I'm working on. I mean, here's the thing, right? Like I said, technology is a baseline. If we go back to school and there is the baseline of technology, which is still, there's still 7 to 9 estimated million children who do not have access and have laptops at home. So that baseline is still not met, right? Let's not kid ourselves about that. Even if we meet that baseline, if we still just give worksheets and give boring factory model education to young people, but via computers, we are in trouble, because that type of learning is not going to prepare young people to deal with global and complex challenges of the 21st and 22nd century, right? And I can talk more about this later, but technology is not the end goal. Technology is a baseline to get us to a place where we can think radically different about where learning happens, about how it happens, and about all kinds of other things, like just blow up our entire conception of education. If we go back and every student is one-to-one, but we're still like just doing worksheets but on computers, we have a problem.
And Bruce, let's come to you to hear a little bit about what's going on specifically in Charlotte, and maybe some of your responses to what Sunanna has said.
I just yield my time back to her. I just want to keep hearing what she has to say, because she's got me fired up over here. So, but I would gladly yield my time. Actually, I am interested in hearing more from you. Just so in Charlotte, I think there's the bright shiny object. And I think this is sort of the human condition. It's like, what's the bright shiny thing that people pay attention to, and then how those, how do you get people to sustain that or see beyond that? And so, the bright shiny object is not actually shiny. It's a pandemic, but people are paying attention to it, and it's drawing light on these other issues. And so, in Charlotte, we're seeing local officials who were were more placating. We're more like, oh yeah, I know this is an issue, but they weren't then necessarily driving for the change we needed to change regulations or change policy at the local and state level. Not all of them, but as a majority, to really make the kind of systemic changes we need. And so, while we're seeing that open up and we're seeing more people be willing to have those conversations, we saw things like, within a couple of weeks from sending the students home, a couple of philanthropies or philanthropic organizations and individuals provided about $1 million to purchase 6,000 hotspots that would go to students who were going home, who were taking a Chromebook. That's what we have here in Charlotte in our school system. We're taking a Chromebook home to a house that didn't have internet. And bright, shiny object, story in the news, people feel good about it. But to Sunanna's point, there's still thousands of students that don't have that. And so how do you perhaps celebrate these small wins, but keep the focus on the overall goal that we're not done yet? And I think that's we might get to this later, but I think that's the difference between looking at these systemic issues, but realizing that there are individual people who are part of those systems. And this, going back to the keeping the pressure on and the foot on the gas, is you have to root out every single person in that decision tree that makes those decisions and convince each of those people, if they aren't already convinced, as to why they need to pay attention and focus on these things. And that's the long, hard work that particularly people who look like me need to be involved in to change these systems that have for so long disproportionately impacted communities that are marginalized.
Thank you. Devin, let me turn to you. As you listen to Bruce and Sunanna talk about what's going on in their communities and in the US writ large, is Darmstadt facing similar challenges? And if so, what has the city undertaken to try to close some of these gaps?
Okay. Well, we talked about that education is not my area of expertise, so I can only tell you what I heard from my colleagues and read in the newspaper. Broadband access in itself is not that big a problem here in Darmstadt, and even most German cities don't have that much of a problem here. But I found a statistic that in 2018, 36% of children with a lower economic background said that in their family, max one of a mobile device or laptop or desktop PC were available. So if you have two kids and one parent who has to work with those, so that would be very similar. And one of the first acts we had to do here was also collect old laptops and tablets from companies to spread to the schools. And in Germany, the government has now decided to give $500 million, American bill, 500 million euros to schools to buy laptops to lend out to students who are in need because parents are on social security or unemployment. And yeah, so in Germany in general, this is a big problem too. Yeah, if 36% of children say max one device, that's not good enough. Yeah.
So Devin, thank you for weighing in on that, even though it's not your primary area of focus. I know that you do work on issues around digital infrastructure and also cybersecurity, and that plays into this whole discussion as well. With so many people and even institutions shifting to doing everything online, what sort of impact has there been on the digital infrastructure and on the capacity to support that infrastructure?
In Darmstadt, the city administration had in the first days of the pandemic the priority to send as many people as possible to home office. And now around 700 people can work from home in the city administration. And although they mostly do it for 2 days and then another team comes in and, that's very similar to what I heard from the US sometimes. But meetings are now all online. In the beginning, there was trouble with especially VPN, virtual private networks, but switches and servers have very quickly been upgraded, so it's not a problem anymore here in Darmstadt. And the city of Darmstadt in April spent an additional €250,000 euros on its own IT. And that's not counting additional money for school IT or for the utilities or whatever. So there was a huge jump now, and the head of city IT told me he had achieved more in changing processes in those last 2 months than in 15 years before that. It seemed to him like the good old days of IT departments in the late 80s, yeah, before everything was regulated to a standstill. And he still hopes to ride that wave a bit to get more done.
And what about data security? I mean, obviously, any American who's watching knows that in Germany, there's a great debate over privacy of data, and everywhere there's a concern about the security of personal data. How has Digitalstadt Darmstadt dealt with data security questions?
Okay, there are two things. One, in Germany, many officials consider Zoom, Teams, Skype not safe from a privacy perspective. And that's why we, as Digitalstadt, together with the city, introduced a big blue button. That's an open source, web session software. And now 25 schools use it. In the high times, there were up to 5,000 users a day. Some of them several times for different classes, of course, from the schools. So that's one thing we did. And we also have an IT security training course by mail for all interested citizens here in Darmstadt. And come April, we added home office specific trainings to that. And here I see two dangerous aspects of the current corona crisis, because many companies now are giving employees access to their servers from outside for the first time. Yeah? And normally even specialists like, what was the last thing I heard about Oracle, make mistakes when doing that. So caution is really important. And when in doubt, you should prioritize security over easy accessibility. You should use two-factor authentication. You have to secure your firewalls and upgrade all your servers all the time. And the other thing here is the so-called CEO fraud. It has been around forever. Yeah, it's some kind of spear phishing. Someone would write to a transaction or payment department in a company. I'm the CEO. We desperately need a transaction now to some company, and please do it now. And now you can't go across the hall and ask your boss, or you can't even call him, because now all the time he is in calls. Yeah. What else is there? So people might transfer money when they can't afford it at all right now in this crisis. So train your colleagues and train your employees.
Thank you, Devin. And Bruce, what's the situation like in Charlotte when it comes to these infrastructure and data protection questions?
I mean, I think first is recognizing I'm not an expert at these, so I'm speaking completely anecdotally here. You know, we're a banking center, the second largest financial institution or center outside of New York City. So there are lots of professionals in our community who are focused on those areas. What that means for us as a community is access to that talent. So there are folks who do this professionally for the banks, who are also involved in community organizations like the Code for America Brigades and things like that, that are offering their expertise to civic projects related to cybersecurity and things like that. You know, I think that for most of the communities that we serve, they're thinking about how they're going to put food on the table and pay their water and electric bill. And so cybersecurity is, I mean, I think they might, I don't want to speak for them. What I hear them say directly to me are more related to issues of cyberbullying in schools, and perhaps less in the adult population about the concerns of cybersecurity. I'm not saying that we don't see those and we don't talk about those, but the areas that we focus on are typically more basic human needs. I do want to just take a quick moment also to think about the context of these conversations. Oftentimes one of the barriers, as you mentioned, like how does this conversation penetrate and sustain, is oftentimes people will say, if we meet new organizations, oh, you should talk to our IT director, you should talk to the CIO. They see this digitalization, as it rightfully is, as a technology conversation. But what we miss in doing so is the broader reality that this is not about technology as the end, but as facilitating new opportunity in people's lives. whether that's a senior who's able to connect with their grandkids or live in their home longer because they're able to use tools to remotely visit their doctor and they might have transportation issues, whether that's somebody finding a job and creating a new opportunity in their life or a student learning. The technology and the digitalization is only facilitating these ultimate outcomes that people are trying to achieve. And oftentimes I think the barrier for these conversations is they get stuck or siloed in a specific technology lens, and it's go talk to the CIO about it, not go talk to the CEO about it, or as an anecdotal example. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's really about creating opportunity in people's lives, not about the technology.
Thanks. Thank you, Bruce. So Sunanna, I wanted to come back to you. We've obviously talked a lot about students throughout our conversation so far today, but we haven't really talked as much about teachers and faculty. And I actually had a question for you about teacher training, but we've received a viewer question, which I'd like to read to you. The COVID-19 issue revealed the fact that faculty and staff do not have access to the internet. What are your cities doing to make sure teachers and staff have devices and access to internet to create or help online schooling? And perhaps related to that, and I think this is a point that Bruce brought up before, often teachers are not prepared for online education in the same way as they are for classroom education. And so I guess, Sunanna, since you have a broad view, given the work that you're doing at Teach for America, any thoughts on sort of the hurdles facing faculty and training for teachers?
I just first want to say that the question is a really good one, because we do often talk about the digital divide in terms of young people, but we know that it is also educators, staff, adults, families. If we consider, which I like to do, educators as a broad term too. I mean, we're talking about librarians, museum educators, hey, aunties, uncles, cousins, siblings who are educators in a young person's life. And every one of those folks that is not connected or doesn't have that connectivity is going to have an impact on the learning that happens during a young person's waking hours. So all I can say about that, honestly, is so much about this is so, because of the way the education system is set up around property taxes in the United States and the way that districts are divided, so much of it is just district by district. Where I was from in Pennsylvania, we had 43 school districts in one county, which the population of the county was not that large. Some of those districts was 500 young people, right? And so, every one of those superintendents, every one of those school boards has a different way of handling, how do we do teacher training? How do we figure out what those security protocols are? How do we make sure all of our staff and teachers are connected to the internet? There are some overarching organizations. I think about places like Digital Promise or the Aurora Institute that are providing a lot of, point in time helpful opportunities in professional development and, best case scenarios and things like that for school districts. But ultimately, it's a really kind of district by district strategy with certainly some support from state and federal governments, things like the E-rate program and stuff like that. But really, it really comes down to what is each district able to do in order to get faculty and staff not only connected, but also trained. And again, I'm going to go back to that training needs to not just be like, how do we lecture at kids for 8 hours a day, but via Zoom? Like, it's about, what are the ways in which young people can be really engaged, both virtually and inside school. And one thing that's been really interesting to see is, I don't know how familiar folks are with project-based learning, but the schools that are really thinking about the future and doing school in dramatically different ways are the ones that have actually had, upwards of 90% attendance during virtual school, because for a whole bunch of reasons that I can get into. But there's also a big part about like, how are teachers trained and what was the education like before COVID has a huge impact on how things are happening, how things are playing out now for educators and for young people.
So maybe actually give us a couple of those details about project-based learning.
Yeah, so there's a whole kind of groundswell, maybe not groundswell, maybe it's bigger than that, in education in the United States right now that's talking about how do we go from a factory model of education, an industrial age model of education where, a student does history for an hour and then stops, and then does English for an hour and then stops, and then does whatever for an hour and then stops, a test-driven culture, a culture where young people are kind of lectured at and have no power in the system. And what we're seeing is that there are a lot of schools, I can mention, you know, folks like the Big Picture network of schools who've been seeing high attendance rates during COVID, schools like High Tech High, so there's a lot of them across the country. And they're thinking about, like, how do we do interdisciplinary learning? How do we do learning across grade levels? How do we really meet each and every young person exactly where they are and make sure that they are succeeding at the highest degrees possible? And so, you know, there's a lot of folks that are thinking about how do we come back to school from a compliance frame, right? Like, how do we make sure students are spaced apart in their regular traditional desks? How do we make sure that in the cafeteria, there's only one student at each table? When, you know, a lot of the schools that are doing well now and are continuing to think about reinvention in the education system, a totally upended way of learning and thinking about learning, you know, it's less thinking about compliance and more thinking about, you know, how do we just continue to push and not go back to normal and come back to an entirely different school system that really values youth power, that affirms each and every identity of the students in the classroom so they feel relevance in learning. Before, I was talking about how folks are not showing up even if they have computers and internet access. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is systemic issues like digital redlining, which have prevented communities for a long time from accessing digital technologies. The second is the economy. So either young people are working or their parents are working and they're taking care of their siblings. Obviously that's not true in all cases, but in a lot of cases that is very true. And the third is that, like, learning is wholly irrelevant for the majority of young people in this country. Like, why would they come to school if they don't have to, right, when they're being, you know, like, when their identities are not affirmed, when they feel no power within the school structure, when everything they're learning has no connection to the real world or what they actually think or care about, and when there's this power dynamic where the only place you learn is at school, when we know that actually young people are learning for all their waking hours. And so the question is, like, how do we upend all of those things so that young people are supported, so they're affirmed, so they have power, so that they feel that learning is relevant? And this is the time, right? We are in a moment where we can make that happen.
In Charlotte, we had a focus group with teachers Tuesday. 263 teachers in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools applied for 48 spots to have a conversation about what the impacts were. And they talked about how the moment the school said, we're not gonna grade for the end of the semester, was when, to your point, 60% of the kids were like checked out. Like, why do if that was the motivation that was one of the motivations to stay engaged, was because they knew they were gonna get graded. And now they're not getting graded. They weren't even participating. Only same statistics we were hearing from them, 40% of the people showing up.
And Devin, slightly different, but I understand that DigitaDomjot Darmstadt has had a program in place to help parents, to help adults deal with the current challenges, less focused on the schooling of their kids, and more on the pandemic.
We had those I talked about those big blue button. We had sessions for teachers alone with so-called Medienpädagogen. I don't know, media educators from universities and similar institutes help teachers in the beginning get a grip on how to deal with these new kind of teaching and what to focus on, not the technical things. Yeah, we had other people for that, help them install it, help with when connections break up, all that. No, for how to think differently. And then we did parent-teacher conferences online, and also had those Medienpädagogen there to help the parents understand how their children's behavior will change when they are in front of the PC all the day. What do you do with other media they want to consume during the day, and how to handle that influx, especially for younger children. And there were 300 people, 400 people came to those weekly sessions, and they started their own subgroups and discussed, and there was a real huge demand for that.
Well, thank you. So it's amazing how quickly an hour passes, and we've had a fantastic discussion so far, but but I'd like to maybe close by asking each of you the same question. And Devin, let's start with you, and then Bruce, and then Sunanna, I'll give you the last word. And the question that I have is as you reflect back on the last 3 or 4 months, what elements of digitalization have you seen implemented that you hope will become permanent and be a part of the new normal?
What I think will become permanent, and that's a good thing, is that home office for many jobs will not stay at this level, but it is here to stay and it won't fall back. It won't go away, and we can fall back on it in emergencies. And it will also help a lot people who have to care for their children alone, who have disabilities. So that's a really good thing, that home office is now the new normal for some time. Yeah, I want to go back to the office, don't misunderstand me, but I think that's a progress here. What many people would like to go away again is this homeschooling. Parents around me, and well, the newspapers are full of it. Parents demand, take my children back to school. You see, homeschooling has a really low acceptance rate in Germany compared to the US. No one likes it here. And also the general agreement is that students from poor backgrounds will suffer from it and the gap will widen. Yeah. So we hope that goes away.
Thank you. Bruce, what are your thoughts on elements that you've seen implemented for the first time, or you know, introduced, that you hope will become part of the new normal?
I mean, I see the 2 crashing waves being the pandemic and the reform conversations around systemic racism here in the US kind of hitting at the same moment. And the opportunity that we have has been talked about a number of times in this call about the systemic change that's needed, and people approach and get to that position in different places, and some obviously are very afraid of that because they're part of that system, whether that's the education system that needs massive overhaul, and so there's a sense of identity that people get in that. And I'm hoping that this moment in time gives people to, you know, rethink about how they're working, and they obviously are doing that, thinking about their home office, but more broadly think about the systems and the way that we want to be as a people and as a society and as a culture, not only here in the US, but across the globe. And so I think that this is kind of going back to the very beginning, the opportunity to keep our foot on the gas on creating that systemic change, being part of that change personally, that will then ultimately change the systems we need to, you know, allow people to thrive in a modern society, economy, and democracy, and be happy, right? At the end of the day, if I could have a happiness index and use that as my North Star, that would be a great outcome. But I think there's this really unique moment in time to bring people into the idea of systemic change who might have been part of the systems that have been preventing these kinds of opportunities from happening.
And Sunanna, the last word goes to you.
Appreciate that. I've talked about this a lot already, so I'll be quick. On the 2 waves front that Bruce said, I've already talked a lot about how the school system just needs to, our education system needs to change. One thing I haven't talked a lot about is the racism that's baked into the curriculum and pedagogy in this country. And so I hope that those 2 waves actually intersect in having a lot of the whiteness that's baked into the US education system really re-examined and completely dismantled for a new way that we learn in this country. I also really, really hope that, that we value teachers and we value parents and caregivers in the community after this, right? Because to what Devin said, like, yo, parents are being like, oh wait, we should probably pay teachers like $1 million for what they do. There's a revaluing going on about caregivers in this country, particularly teachers, but other sorts of essential workers like healthcare workers. And we better keep the gas on that too, to make sure that we revalue folks that are really giving true value, even if it's not like monetary value in this society, right? So that reconceptualization of value needs to happen. And I hope I never hear again something that has always made me really annoyed in this field, which is, well, you know, these parents just don't care. I hope I never hear that phrase again, because we also need to revalue parents, caregivers, family members, community, auntie, uncles, cousins, siblings, right? Because they are just doing incredible work right now to make sure that young people are educated in this country. So that's what I hope continues after this.
Well, a huge thanks to all three of you for this incredibly thoughtful and incredibly thought-provoking and positive conversation. We obviously have a lot of challenges that we're trying to deal with, but it also is an opportunity. And I think with the optimism that each of you has shared with us, we can, keep up the momentum and really try to continue to fight the good fight. So not only do I want to thank you all for joining us today and for having this discussion, but also for the work that you do every day to try to make your communities a better place. I want to thank our viewers as well, but this has been a fabulous conversation, and I just hope everybody stays healthy.